Well, hello, and welcome to this webinar launching the 2021 Strategic Note on Religion and Diplomacy, with a particular focus on engagement between governments and religious groups when it comes to the global rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Judd Birdsall, and I serve as a Senior Research Fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is hosting this webinar today. I also serve as the project director of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, the TPNRD. The TPNRD is a forum of diplomats and officials from North America and Europe who are the point people on matters of religion and foreign policy within their respective foreign ministries or multilateral organizations. The TPNRD project is based at the Berkeley Center and funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. A few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded for the benefit of those who aren't able to join us for this live event. And the video with captions will be posted online soon, and you'll receive an email with a link to that video once it's up. Now, an important feature of the TPNRD is the way in which it connects the worlds of policy and of scholarship. And so alongside our network of diplomats, we also have an advisory council of top experts from Europe and North America who advise our diplomats, who point them to resources, who sometimes also create new resources like this strategic note. And we're delighted to be joined by several members of our advisory council on this call today, including our two co-chairs of the advisory council, Peter Mandeville and Aaron Wilson. Aaron will introduce the strategic note, and Peter will then chair our panel discussion. Let me introduce those two co-chairs now. Aaron Wilson is Associate Professor of Politics and Religion, as well as Vice Dean and Director of Education within the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Groningen. And Peter Mandeville is Professor of International Affairs at George Mason University, and also director of its Center for Global Islamic Studies. And he's a Senior Research Fellow at the Berkeley Center. Peter and Aaron, thank you so much for your excellent work in putting this year's strategic note together. And Aaron, I want to hand things off to you to introduce it to our audience. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Judd. Thanks for the invitation. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I see that I think Ruth has placed a link to the strategic note in the chat. So if you would like to view this year's strategic note, please follow that link. This is the third of our strategic notes. And just to give you a bit of background, what we try and do with the strategic note each year is to select issues we discuss with our government members, but also with our advisory council members about issues that they think are going to be on the agenda for the next 12 months that diplomacy needs to pay attention to, issues that intersect with religion. And what we mean by that is where religion is significant, not necessarily the main cause or the thing to pay attention to, but where religion matters. And then we invite people from academia, but also working in civil society to contribute pieces that provide an overall analysis of those various issues and point to what the key developments are, what is at stake, why these issues are important, and then what is likely to be important or what will matter as the year progresses, and providing some advice for what to look out for and kind of a lens for how to read some of these issues as the year progresses, as we move forward. And so in this year's issue, we kind of had to, we couldn't ignore the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have a special issue on religious actors and the response to COVID-19, and that's what is the topic of this panel today. We're really lucky to have the contributors for that. But then we also have another range of issues that are covered, including the Abraham Accords, the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, religious rivalry between UAE and Qatar, the role of Islam in the war in Yemen. We also have a wonderful piece by Mariel Peterson, one of our advisory council members, on conflicting rights related to there's apparent conflict between FORB and gender equality. And then we also have a short piece which is connected to a larger piece, which you can also find on the TPNRD website, on the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and Muslims in South Asia, written by Matt Nelson. So many of the Advisory Council members are also involved in the panel today. And so I won't spend a huge amount of time talking about our wonderful Advisory Council, but I do want to give them a shout out because they are invaluable to our community. And we're just hugely grateful for their time and their expertise and their knowledge as they help Peter and I put together these kinds of resources that we know are so helpful to our diplomatic members, but also really helpful to other academics and other people working in the religion and diplomacy nexus. Peter, I will hand over to you now, and in case there's anything you want to add on this.
Great, thank you very much, Erin, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So as Erin mentioned, it was always going to be the case that this year's strategic note would have a considerable focus on the COVID-19 pandemic, and more specifically, the intersection of the pandemic and religion. And even beyond that, a particular focus on the role of religious actors and religious leaders in helping to address various aspects of the COVID-19 challenge. And so our panel this morning will really showcase and feature the expertise that we curated for that particular section of the strategic note. In the interest of time, I'm not going to give full introductions of their impressive professional backgrounds and bios, but as they begin speaking, I will place in the chat room a set of links that will allow you to read more about their many professional accomplishments. But just very briefly, in the order in which they will be speaking, we have Catherine Marshall, who is a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and also executive director of the World Faith Development Dialogue. We also have Dr. Olivia Wilkinson, who's the Director of Research for the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. We're joined as well by Dr. Azza Karam, who's the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, and also holds a professorship of religion and development at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And finally, rounding out the panel, we have Dr. Jan Marco Müller, who is the Science and Technology Advisor to the European Union's External Action Service. Catherine is going to kick us off by providing a general overview of the current state of knowledge and research on the intersection of religion and public health. We'll then turn to Azza, who will talk about some of the possibilities, but also challenges associated with building public health partnerships across the secular religious frontier. And we'll then hear from Olivia, who will give us an overview of the current state of play in terms of key actors and relationships at the intersection of religion and COVID-19. And then Jan Marco will round us off by talking about the current state of the global vaccination campaign and his own reflections on these challenges as someone whose professional work is situated at the interface of science and policy. So without further ado, let me hand things over to my colleague, Catherine, to kick us off. Catherine, over to you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. My role is to situate the COVID pandemic and the relationships with religion in the context of diplomacy, particularly. It is interesting that health has been the main leading edge in bringing religious knowledge, religious communities into engagement with public policy generally. But the COVID epidemic has been a particularly intense area of focus. We had been following in the Berkeley Center quite intensively various other pandemic situations, the HIV/AIDS, Zika, Ebola, malaria, etc. And so immediately as the crisis broke out, we launched with the Joint Learning Initiative, which Olivia represents, really a daily effort to follow what had been happening. And basically, the religious roles were obvious at a much earlier stage. We had a frustration in general that many lessons from the earlier pandemics had not been taken well into account or not systematically taken into account, the religious dimensions. But in this case, it was several super spreader events in Korea and across Asia that put particular attention on the religious roles. And so it was obvious first that they played important roles in advocacy, positive and negative. Right now with the vaccination, some of the misinformation, for example, is associated with religion, but the active effort to convey messages about health and vaccination has been a much more positive role. So the resistance to public health measures has been a second theme, including particularly during the shutdowns. We've had a particular interest in two other areas. The first is the social protection responses, which includes food and water, evictions. So many people in so many parts of the world have been in need, children out of school, etc. And in all of those cases, religious communities, in ways that we will probably never know fully, have mobilized individually as communities, and across secular and religious. So this social protection response, I think, has particular importance as we look to pandemic preparedness for what people inevitably know is the next one. And the second area that has been particularly interesting to us is the peace building effort, which starts with the fact, which is probably inevitable, it has been in most pandemics in history, that there will be scapegoating. There will be increases in tensions among groups, and particularly often associated with specific religious communities. So that the role of religious leaders and communities in trying to calm the tensions, to identify what's happening, to document it, and to address people's concerns and fears in systematic ways. That has been an important area. But in addition, the world has too many conflicts these days, and many of those conflicts, their nature is changing as a result of the COVID emergencies. And of course, particularly the shutdowns, which have made peace building work more difficult. In some cases, those who are fomenting the conflicts have taken advantage of the situation to step up their activities, nefarious activities. It has proved more difficult for many of the religious peace builders to engage in the kinds of dialogue that are necessary in order to forestall emergencies. So those are some of the areas: the gathering issue, what happens with religious practice, for example, the spiritual care, but also funerals have been a major point. The social protection functions, including in health and education, but also foods, care of the elderly, care of the disabled, the peace building and conflict management, all are areas that we've been tracking and that you can find in our repository, which we have continued to update really on a daily basis. The final area I'll mention is that from the start of the crisis, we have hoped that the COVID crisis would be an opportunity to do things better in the future, fairer and more green, more just. And there has been quite a lot of work and reflection on what comes next after the pandemic. How can we not lose the advantage of a crisis, as people say, ironically. And we are concerned that the crisis continues, that it has an extraordinarily heavy cost on the poorest, that the inequalities in the world have been accentuated, exacerbated, and made more visible. But we are hopeful that all of us working together and working on the knowledge and the lessons we're learning can look to a better future. So I'll turn it over.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. What a great broad overview of the landscape. Let me hand things over now to Azza and invite her to talk a little bit about the possibilities and challenges of working across the secular religious frontier. Azza, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter Erin Wilson and all colleagues, thank you very much for this lovely opportunity to come together again above all else. I think Catherine has actually encapsulated pretty much everything as per her usual. There's a couple of maybe nuances that I would make to what Catherine has beautifully illustrated and drawn out. The first nuance is that not all religious organizations are alike, and not all are created alike, and not all serve alike. So in a way, as important as it is to get the view from 30,000 feet, it doesn't help us realize a few interesting geopolitical dynamics that are basically an elaboration of the dynamics that Catherine shared. What do I mean specifically? I mean that those religious organizations which have been struggling with particular stereotypes, such as the Islamic ones, have found it extraordinarily complicated to try to form partnerships to serve in the same areas, same neighborhoods, same spaces. So in a way, on the one hand, the bad news is that the stereotypes have become much more about Muslims, about evangelicals, about whatever, have become more ingrained because the atmosphere in general of fear that the COVID pandemic harvested in so many places, if not in all places, has tended to deepen people's fears. And therefore, with the deepening of fear comes the lesser inclination to be more nuanced about difference. And religious difference is certainly one of the hostages, if you will, of that particular fear. So that means that Muslims are even a bit more suspect, and Muslim faith-based organizations who have had a very hard time proving their worth, and having to be presenting multiple forms of audits just to be accepted, particularly by Western governments, have simply had that challenge increase exponentially. But at the same time, it has, on the good side, it has meant that with maybe one or two religious organizations, Jewish, and to a lesser extent Christian, there is a more deliberate attempt. Also because remember that what has been happening with COVID has also involved Black Lives Matter, racist issues coming to the fore. So on the one hand, there's a deepening of some of these negative stereotypes. On the other hand, there is a more deliberate attempt on the part of some to try to counter these tendencies towards marginalization and alienation of certain religious groups. And therefore, we've seen an interesting convergence of Muslim Christian, Muslim Jewish coming together in specific areas to try to form those partnerships and to serve together, which is a bit more complicated now because, of course, again, so the intent, the initiative, the want to do this in partnership is there. But they're having now to do this in a broader environment, which is relatively more hostile to any kinds of partnerships, but especially partnerships with these people or those people. So that's one nuance that I would point us to. And again, it's not all Black and it's not all white. I think that, excuse me, I think that interfaith organizations, which are actually few and far between, because interfaith organizations who actually carry out service delivery work in different communities are not that much. But interfaith organizations have faced another interesting domain. There is more public policy interest in what they do, but at the same time, there is less will to provide resources. So yes, do tell us what you're seeing and what you're doing and how things are unfolding, but we really don't have the ability to give any funds at the moment. At the same time, those who are making those kinds of comments are indeed giving funds, but they're giving funds to largely Christian, Catholic, and evangelical organizations. So there's an interesting space in which the Catholic, number one, and number two, the evangelical are getting more resources to serve, obviously during the COVID pandemic, than before, from secular donors, many of whom have turned more willingly towards those groups as they acknowledge the value of religious engagement, religious service, because everybody can see that the religious organizations are at the front lines everywhere. But as that is being acknowledged, the willingness to support is going towards largely the Catholic initiatives and endeavors. And the third trend, I think, that I would just like to nuance a bit is the fact that we are now, ironically, the COVID pandemic has coincided with what we discussed many times before in TPNRD and elsewhere, which is that religion is in. It's the new fashion in international affairs, foreign policy, international development, etc. It's the new thing. Everybody's now interested in religion. So fascinating that there's now a pandemic, and so people are looking definitely much more interest in what is going on within the religious communities. But at the same time, given the politics of what's been the political transitions or lack thereof that have been taking place around the world, religious groups we are seeing this within the context of Religions for Peace, the organization I serve, that the interreligious communities, interreligious councils that we oversee, that are part of us, are finding more attention coming from certain political circles to them and their work. But given the polarization in the political space, increased political attention is not actually a good thing. It is a double-edged sword, because the increased political attention on the parts of governments, whether in Ethiopia, Myanmar, or elsewhere, has a cost. And the cost is that we want you to work to affirm what we are doing, even if it is a brutal coup that we're killing lots of people, but we want that affirmation, you see. Or even if we've severely repressed civil and political rights, we want you to affirm that that's a good idea, right? So the interest in the work of the interreligious councils of Religions for Peace has increased, clearly, but there is a cost, a manipulation cost that comes with it, precisely because this is happening at a time when political rifts are perhaps at their deepest in a very long time, or perhaps at the most widespread than they have been in a while, since we've witnessed the Second World War. So these things are coalescing to provide a very interesting tapestry of religious geopolitics. And so now the interreligious councils, which actually existed and did a lot of social service work as well as public advocacy, quite peacefully without much attention really, are now finding themselves called upon by certain political parties, certain regimes, to play an affirming role in a time when they would really much rather not have anything to do with that. And so some of them are being attracted to this political space where they can rub shoulders more closely with governments and government officials. And that is leading to a rift within the interreligious spaces. So I just wanted to point out these nuance, those three aspects: the funding, the dimension of interreligious collaboration, and the geopolitical impact of interreligious space on this in this pandemic. And I would just urge folks to bear in mind that Religions for Peace it's an extremely large organization. So it's hard to actually elucidate, given that there's 90 interreligious councils in 90 countries with very different circumstances. And having to trace a pattern can often be very, very interesting and very, very challenging. But looking at it this way, the fourth, and I promise the last thing I want to say, is that it's becoming increasingly hard to see the difference between religious leaders and political leaders. It really is becoming extremely difficult to see that difference. And I'm not just saying that as a cynic. I mean, for some of us who've been immersed in this space for a long time, one would say, yes, and we've always known in religious leaders can be the original diplomats and the original politicians. But I think we went through a relatively long phase in which religious leaders were looked at as an alternative to in fact, Religions for Peace 50 years ago was founded precisely by a whole bunch of religious leaders and institutions from around the world because of that aspiration and the reality they lived as an alternative to the political spaces and the multilateral spaces, which were considered in need of assistance, in need of support, in need of a moral conscience, if you will. So that now is really an aspiration. Now, as we observe the the workings of different religious leaders and different religious institutions in this contemporary space, which has been accentuated in so many ways by the COVID pandemic. Now, I have to tell you, I'm finding it increasingly difficult to see where coming with a UN background, having dealt with so many political representatives, I'm looking around and saying, wait a minute, where are the religious folks here? So yeah, that's it.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Azza. It's always such a pleasure to listen and learn from you. And thank you for so wonderfully building on and adding some of these nuances and operational complexities as they bear on some of the practical challenges that we face around these issues. Before we turn over to our second pair of speakers today, I just wanted to remind our audience that we will have a question and answer session after the panel, and you may actually begin to participate in that at any point simply by using the Q&A function from the main Zoom control panel. That'll open a window where you can type your question for any of our panelists, and you can do that at any point. So without further ado, let me now turn over to Olivia Wilkinson, who's going to give us an update and some information about the current landscape of religious actors and relationships around COVID-19. Olivia, welcome. Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Okay. Hi, everyone. So we've already had quite a good overview of many of the elements that are happening. I actually wrote 2 articles in this year's strategic note. I'm going to speak very quickly on the first one. The first one was about the lessons learned from Ebola around faith engagement. And we have talked about that before. I mean, there's been a little bit more, well, actually a lot more covered on that in that area. But the point to get across from the experiences with Ebola was that the influence and engagement of religious leaders has been called transformational and game-changing, even though the initial response did not take those cultural and religious factors into account. Some of the well-known game changers in that response included the development and implementation of guidelines from WHO on safe and dignified burial practices, which was particularly influential. And religious leaders were able to step into the roles of spreading messages about the disease in religious services, modeling good practice, interpreting medical information through religious teachings, and providing immediate assistance, both material and psychosocial, for those in need. The questions, however, considering we know a lot more about what happened in the Ebola response, is how that was going to translate to COVID. And of course, COVID-19 is occurring at an unprecedented scale, meaning that some of those lessons are not easily transferable. But we have seen some parallels. So for example, the WHO in the first few months of the pandemic, alongside many other agencies, including probably some people on this call, helped, people came together in an advisory group to put out guidance materials for faith actors on adaptations to religious gatherings and other adaptations that will be needed. So there was that same effort towards guidelines from WHO, as we saw in Ebola. But as it's guidance without specific country level implementation strategies for COVID-19, it's hard to understand what effect they have had. Religious engagement is occurring, but at varying levels from country to country. And of course, the next hurdle, and the hurdle we're experiencing at the moment, is rollout of vaccines, which is this test to the extent and commitment of the engagement from international actors involved in vaccine rollout with faith actors. So that's what I'm actually going to focus on a little bit more now. So for the vaccine rollout, we started to see conversations happening last year, but of course, just naturally with the phases of vaccine availability, they really got, these conversations got going in earnest a bit more this year. Partnerships with faith actors in immunization work is not a new area. As we know from even the very, very first vaccination efforts a couple of hundred years ago, had faith actors involved both as critics and supporters of vaccination efforts. So we've seen that dynamic from the very beginning vaccination efforts. At the moment for COVID-19 globally, UNICEF and WHO are leading many of the efforts as in general as key international agencies involved. And then in their faith engagement side, we've seen, for example, that there was a WHO and UNICEF meeting with through the UN's Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development through their Multi-Faith Advisory Council at the end of March. And then both UNICEF and WHO are also working and bringing out further guidance on COVID vaccines, and WHO in collaboration with UNICEF and Religions for Peace this time is running various webinars on faith engagement in COVID-19 with a recent webinar particularly on overcoming barriers to vaccination. There's also a plan for a conference in the autumn. There's been several events to really highlighting a recommitment to faith engagements from some of these international agencies. But as I said, there's perhaps also representing a rush to faith engagement, of which we also have to be somewhat cautious. At country level, the picture is emerging. I think obviously we know that there is a wide variation in vaccination rollout from country to country. So, you know, in some countries there hasn't been the ability to really get started yet. Although what we would say from previous experiences and knowledge of vaccination campaigns is it's never too early to start working with faith actors about advising on potential challenges in community engagement, linking to faith-based health facilities for cooperation, etc. So there's a lot of potential and a need for countries to engage early on. So I'll go quickly, but a few country initiatives. We've seen the Faith for Vaccines Summit at the end of May in the US. I think, again, many people on this call will already be familiar with Faith for Vaccines, that summit, which had many high-level speakers, and they're continuing to do work, including work particularly with young people in faith communities. And there's also more and more examples coming out of religious buildings being used as vaccination sites around the country, local, regional, national level webinars, in the US, many reaching particularly underserved communities. So there is an interest and perhaps examples that can be transferable from some of the US experience. We've also seen, for example, in Kenya and in East Africa, there's considerable involvement. The Christian Health Association of Kenya is on the National COVID-19 Vaccine Steering Committee, for example. Another example, again, with African Council of Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace, worked with the All Africa Conference of Churches, and at the end of March held a conference on faith and science in conversation, which had some element on the COVID-19 vaccinations as well. So there's various events, conferences, efforts in coordination happening from faith actors at their national level to become engaged and more engaged in both advocacy on vaccine equity issues and then also the practical rollout of vaccinations. So that's a quick snapshot. I think that obviously this is a evolving and hopefully quickly evolving state of play, as there'll be considerable vaccine rollout in the next months, but also years. So we're going to have to be monitoring this for a considerable amount of time and keeping our eyes open to some of the dynamics that both Catherine and Azza have already mentioned. I'll stop there.
Okay, Olivia, that was wonderful. It's very helpful to have that broad overview of how the field is currently set in terms of key actors and emerging relationships. And finally now, for an update and some perspectives from a scientist currently sitting in a policymaking seat, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jan Marco Müller into the conversation. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. So I work as a science and technology advisor in the European External Action Service and serve as a voice of science on the vaccine strategy task force in our house, which is kind of dealing with the global rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. And this event is both very important and very timely. Important because we are faced with an unprecedented challenge, which we haven't seen before, is to vaccinate 8 billion people on this planet. And obviously that we are in this position actually is thanks to science, which in record time has developed a dozen vaccines and another 200 in the pipeline. And this done within a year from discovering the virus, which is really an enormous success, also thanks to international cooperation and thanks to data sharing across the planet. But what we have also seen is since the start of the rollout of the vaccination campaign half a year ago, is that we've seen a lot of inequities between the global north and the global south. In a way, this is also a challenge where we will need all the support we can get to deal with this. Actually, we are at a very timely moment because right now, the United States and the European Union are starting to donate vaccines in a very significant quantities. The European Union has, of course, been exporting vaccines the last 6 months. About roughly half of the production of Europe has been exported, but we haven't yet appeared as a donor in terms of physical vaccines to a significant extent. And both the EU and the US are starting now also to share vaccines, which is not just an epidemiological imperative, but is also an ethical imperative. Now, dealing with this issue of organizing such a vaccine rollout, I think it is very important to have the support of religious and leaders and faith groups. Because let us clear about one fact, vaccines don't save lives. It's vaccination that saves lives. We need to get the vaccines into the arms of people. And to be honest, one thing we as scientists have never been particularly good at is empathy and compassion and emotions, which is of course normal because we are supposed to be the voice of reason. And it's very important to team up with religious leaders to overcome vaccine hesitancy, which is widespread both in the global north and in the global south. I think many religious groups have really done actually already a marvelous job in helping with the vaccination campaign, and we just heard about some of the examples. So I think it is very important that we team up with religious groups, that we team up kind of science, religion, and policy/diplomacy. And I want to give you one example, and Olivia used the example of Ebola. I want to use one example from the recent past, which isn't from the health arena, but it was the Paris Climate Accord. Well, in the negotiations for the Paris Climate Agreement, the two most important documents that influenced the discussion was on one hand, the IPCC report done by thousands of scientists, and on the other hand, it was the papal encyclica, Laudato Si, which also supported the same message. And both of them together were actually enabled to rally nations behind this climate accord, and similar, of course, support we've seen also from other religious groups across the planet. So in a way, the title of this session, Vaccinate Thy Neighbor, is spot on, because it is about vaccinating our neighbor next doors and convincing them to get vaccinated, but it's also about our neighbors on a planetary scale of working together hand in hand to get the vaccines supplied to the world. And that's where, of course, the political challenge lies right now. And I think based on these successful examples from the past, it is very important that we kind of marry the voice of reason, which is science, with the voice of heaven, so to speak, which is represented by the religious groups. Because one important point I want to make at the end, there's one thing science and religion have in common in this pandemic. Both give hope to people. And I think if both pull at the same string on the same side, I think we really can get the job done to vaccinate 8 billion people on this planet. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much, Jan Marco. So everyone, thanks to our speakers, our panelists, who were all incredibly disciplined in terms of their speaking time today, we actually have close to a full 20 minutes available for questions and discussion. So if you'd like to pose a question or a reflection on anything that you heard today, you can do so by pressing the Q&A button in the main Zoom control panel, and that will open up a window that will allow you to type your question. I'm going to start with one that's come in from one audience member, Tang Win, who says, considering the situation in post-coup Myanmar, where ethnic and religious communities oppose the military government, have there been efforts by governments and religious institutions in neighboring countries to provide vaccination to those communities, including internally displaced persons? And I'll go ahead and offer that to anyone on the panel who would like to respond to it. Do I have any takers there? Aza, please go ahead.
It's not a comprehensive overview. First of all, it's a brilliant question. Yes, religious communities are trying to come in with a response. I think the person who posed the question would probably realize that there was a great deal of hope placed on the ASEAN summit, precisely because they needed that window, just a window to try to make sure that the humanitarian, in this case, including vaccines, could potentially be made possible. And there was a tremendous disappointment in that. But I do want to say that UNHCR has been very deliberate in trying to stay the course and help provide some of the vaccinations. The problem is not so much whether there are efforts and attempts and a great deal of will, and indeed religious communities around Myanmar in the neighboring countries trying to put together availability of vaccines and identifying where and how they could be potentially transported. It's not the lack of will, it is the fact that it's in some ways it's a negotiation, make or break with the military regime, that this is unless it's done on the military regime's terms, which are not very clear or comfortable, because there's a price to pay, so to speak, in terms of legitimization. This is what is causing a tremendous amount of anguish at the moment. So it's not lack of will, it is the fact that the vaccine and the humanitarian supplies, not for the first time in history, but as a usual consequence, unfortunately, but humanitarian supplies, including vaccines, have become a political trading issue. What is the word? There's a bargaining chip in this space. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Aza. There have been a couple of you who have asked in the Q&A panel about a link to that recent IFA report that I mentioned on the role of religious actors in the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe that the report is so freshly released that the link actually isn't available at this point, but what we will do is make sure to send a link to it to all registered viewers of this webinar. What I can share and will share in a moment in the chat room is a link to a recent interview with the authors of the report as they were completing it, that will give you a good sense of some of the key themes and issues that they address in their writing. So let me move on to another question now, this one coming from Rubens Brandao Neto Bois or Bis. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. And Rubens asks, could someone give examples of difficulties in vaccination that were created or prompted by religious groups, and anything that we know about best practices in terms of how to address these sorts of challenges? Catherine, and then I'm seeing some body language from several of our panelists. So Catherine, let's start with you.
There are a lot of reports and anecdotal evidence, but also some statistical evidence of what the preoccupations are of people who are resisting. And in the United States, which we have the best documentation on at this point, it is interesting that religious people may be resistant, but when they actually give reasons, it is side effects often, etc. Rather than, and frankly, politics and general fears. But there are some very specific religiously linked concerns about what the vaccines are made of and the process. And the Vatican, for example, has gone out of its way to address the concerns about the use of aborted tissue in the manufacture. And some of the evangelical leaders, including Franklin Graham, for example, have gone out of their way to say that the vaccines are safe, but also a moral duty for those who have been concerned about some of the passages from Revelation. There, in some parts of the world, there's concern, for example, that pig products in some way are part of vaccine. So the evidence is that when religious leaders take a role and proactively reassure, even by having, needles in their arms in public, that makes a difference in helping to overcome some of the resistance. The positive thing is that the passage of time can be helpful, that as people see neighbors and so forth getting vaccinated, the fears seem to retreat a bit, but it's the pace of vaccination in some countries has actually slowed. So if I could come back to the Myanmar situation quickly, which I think is a major preoccupation for all of us. Clearly, there are almost 1 million people living in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has an acute supply problem for vaccinations at this point. Apparently, the pace of vaccination of the population has slowed. Infections are increasing. So obviously, then people will be concerned about the camps in Cox's Bazar. But it is in the context of a crisis situation for that nation, which is the host. So then within Myanmar, I think the snippets I'm picking up are that it's much worse. But anyway, that just the Bangladesh situation, there is a concern about refugee and other vulnerable groups, clearly, but it does depend, as Aza was saying, very much on the broader context.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Why don't we go next to Olivia on this one?
Yeah, thanks. So just briefly, I would point out, and I can put the link in the chat, in our repository, we do have a section of reports, reporting on vaccine hesitancy, conspiracy theories, misinformation connected to faith actors, various religious communities. There has been a lot of reporting in the US, particularly on white evangelicals. That has been an interest area, but as Catherine was already saying, what we see almost across the board is that it's very rarely only a theological issue. There's never and this is something we know from kind of basic religious literacy principle, right? That it's any religious reasoning in this field is always going to be deeply intertwined with other cultural, political, social, economic, etc. Factors. And so that's, again, what we're seeing with the COVID-19 vaccination, as we've seen with previous vaccinations. So I would just point people towards, for many specific examples, towards the repository, and of course we'll be adding new materials as we see them.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivia. Jan Marco, go ahead.
Yeah, just one point to add here. There was a recent poll done in Western African countries, which was published in the Afrobarometer. And the question was asked, what is more effective against COVID-19, prayers or vaccines? And for instance, in Niger, 90% of the population said prayers, which shows you the dimension of the importance of having religious leaders being closely involved into the planning of the vaccination campaigns. Of course, the one doesn't exclude the others. You can both get vaccinated and still pray to be on the safe side, but it is very important that actually these issues are taken on board when you plan a strategy on how to roll out a vaccination campaign in some countries.
Great, thank you very much, Jan Marco. And I'll take the opportunity of your point just to mention that I'm currently co-leading a study with Tariq Masood of Harvard University and Qadir Yildirim of Rice University that has fielded a multi-country survey in the Muslim majority world, exploring the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on religiosity in the Muslim world broadly. And we're just about to put a second survey out to the same countries and looking at the relationship between religiosity and vaccine attitudes and vaccine hesitation. And one of the things we'll be doing is repeating that Afrobarometer question, Jan Marco, that you referenced there, and we'll be looking at it in the context of Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Indonesia, with a sample size of approximately 10,000 across those 5 countries. So stay tuned for some of those materials coming out in the next few months. Going on with the questions, actually, Aza, I forgot to give you an opportunity to respond to this one if you wanted to know. No? Okay, let's keep going then. We have another question coming from Junichi Yahata, who says, Buddhist groups are obviously not majority in terms of population. However, if there are some typical activities or initiatives for encouraging vaccination in people even religiously unaffiliated anywhere in this world, I would like to know the cases. Yes, Aza, please.
Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to say, we've actually noticed, because interestingly enough, Olivia didn't mention this, but one of the key initiatives that's been launched for over a year now since the outbreak is the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund. It's the only fund of its kind that pulls together resources from different religious communities and organizations to support multi-religious responses, in this case, to the COVID pandemic. So it's an initiative that is unique in every way, shape, and form. And it's been working now for just over a year. And one of the most interesting things to observe around this is how many religious communities came through to put some of the resources into this fund. The only religious communities that came through to put resources into pool some of their resources and be willing to give money effectively to other organizations, other religions, were the Buddhist organizations, particularly Risho Koseikai, the Japanese Buddhist community, which is actually one of the founders of Religions for Peace. That is a long-term commitment to multi-religious service. So they were the first to come forward and to support walk the talk, if you will, of supporting multi-religious service, humanitarian service. The Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation has been doing a remarkable amount of work for a very long period of time. And they were ideally positioned and are ideally positioned in the context of vaccine advocacy, prevalence, and attempts to service. Interestingly enough, they're not finding it very easy to be distributors in this space. And that has a lot to do with they're not a big Catholic and they're not a big evangelical organization, and they're not necessarily visibly seen as being present in the Western Hemisphere. So they encounter some of those blowbacks. But in truth, they have been doing a remarkable amount of effort in this space for many, many years. In Religions for Peace, we're able to review all the religious communities. And I just wanted to make a point here that highlighting beginning to look at the value added and the specific service and contribution that Buddhist organizations do is not something that comes naturally in our space. That we tend to look at Muslim, we tend to look at Christian various varieties of it, but we don't really look beyond that much. And I think that blindness, for lack of a better word, that intentional oversight that's been going on for many, 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 many years, including amongst academics, is something that we need to be a bit more self-critical about. We often don't, because we look at the big, and the big are obviously not the minority religions, but effectively some of the Hindu and some of the Buddhist organizations have been the ones spending a great deal of their resources in this space, the COVID space. Now, remember, it's a great deal relative to how big they are and how rich and wealthy they are. So if we were to do that comparative analysis, and I hope somebody does do it at some point, Judd or Peter or Aaron, I think you'll find that the smaller religious communities and organizations, in terms of numbers of adherents, have been contributing way above there's an expression for this, way above the belt or something, way above their level, so to speak.
Punching above their weight.
Thank you very much. Punching above their weight. And we're not looking at that well enough. So that's a brilliant question. And it's a question that deserves to be answered much more rigorously by, for instance, the Joint Learning initiative who are supposed to be the evidence gatherers in this space. It would be good to look at what some of the minority religious organizations are doing, and it would be exceedingly good to look at what multi-religious efforts look like and how they're doing, not just talk about religion per se, but multi-religious efforts and engagements are very timely to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Azza. Any other takers on the panel for this point before I try to squeeze in one more question before we wrap up? If not, I'll just say briefly, Azza, that my own experience in the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs very directly reflects that last point that you made, that while we profess to be an office focused globally on all religious traditions found on this planet, I would say that in practice, 90% of our work focused on engagement with Christian and Muslim communities. So point very well taken. So our final question actually comes from TipNerd's very own Jud Birdsall, who asks, what can we learn from the ethical concerns raised by religious groups and others about vaccine nationalism, now that several rich countries have indeed bought enormous quantities of vaccine doses and vaccinated a large portion of their populations before providing them to other countries? So who would like to tackle that one? Catherine, please.
Yeah, I think we're hearing a lot of senior respected religious leaders calling out this problem, as well as non-religious leaders, that even though it is natural for political leaders to focus on their own populations and the safety of their own populations, this basic message that until everyone is safe, no one is really safe, is one that does not seem to have penetrated the political fog around the COVID issue. I think what we're hoping to see is that once you get past a certain point, that religious communities will take a more active stance in arguing that there should be globally an ethical focus on most vulnerable groups, healthcare workers, the elderly, and now increasingly youth with the Delta variant, and that they will work through their transnational boundaries, their transnational links, to translate some of the ideals of getting vaccines to everyone soon into practice, where they will actually be involved in figuring out some of the logistics, the ethics of priorities, and the ways of dealing with the resistance. And just as one last comment, I think we do have in the chat somewhere, but we will also send you, we are sending out weekly reports on what's happening with religion and COVID, and you can sign up for those. And then the repository has become enormous because we have worked on it far longer than we'd anticipated. But there is a huge wealth of information, and we also welcome you to send more information so that it's as complete as it can be.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. So let me give 30 seconds now to round us off today to each of the other panelists for any reactions to this question or any other points that they wanted to add. So Olivier, Azza, and Jan Marco, let's go in that order. Olivier?
Okay, yes, thanks. So just to round up, going back very quickly to the question on Buddhist organizations, JLI is in fact doing some research right now on our member organizations. And so that does include Tzu Chi and also Soka Gakkai International. So there are many efforts, and we'll hopefully have more information soon. And so that's my main point, that this time next year, when we're talking about the next strategic note, there's going to be even more research. And we have to remember that this will potentially be the most researched pandemic of our times, and religious responses is just one part of that. So I think we're going to learn more and more in the next year, and the rollout of vaccinations is going to be a key time for us to do a lot of learning, and certainly JLI with our colleagues on this call will be involved.
Great, thanks so much, Olivia, and we really do greatly value JLI and all of the contributions you make to all of these issues. Azza, over to you.
A quick point that we are still deeply under-researched on multi-religious work and collaboration. We're still talking about specific religious contributions, specific religions and their engagement. We are not, and which is a bit awkward, we don't have a significant body of scientific literature on multi-religious engagement, whether by governments or by other sectors and organizations, and certainly by other by specific religious groups. How many of these religious groups are actually working in collaboration with one another? I think we're deeply under informed on that. At least those of us who are not working on this. In my case, I have a little bit too much information, actually, which is what I will use to share one point related to Judd's excellent question. First of all, there is no term for vaccine nationalism it's very hard to translate into other languages. So it's interesting that we look at it from the English speaking platforms, and kindly note that all the information that we're talking about is English speaking. We don't know, and we don't have enough information on what's happening in Arabic and Spanish and French, because we're not doing translations, we're doing English speaking. So that's only one part of the world, and it's really not that big. I would say it would be very awkward for us to think that there's a moral outrage that is religiously inspired behind vaccine nationalism, such as it is, because in many cases, just as I've been trying to say now for some years, the religious and the political are often hard to disentangle. So if nationalism in whatever form is an issue, in this case, it happens to be about vaccines, kindly bear in mind that that automatically means there are religious actors engaged in that kind of nationalism too, because that dividing line between the religious and the political spaces is thin enough to begin with, and COVID has made it extremely fraught, if there at all, if it is still there. So all the more reason to be much more versed in how we understand and appreciate and evaluate religious organizations based on whether they are prepared to put their buck with others and give it to others, other religious organizations. They're not. And those of them that are making a huge statement about their ethical beliefs and values. But also let us not assume that the religious is the panacea. It is not. In fact, we might be getting into a space and into a phase, and that is what I see, where the religious is becoming the political tool of today, and the polarization that is entailed is not going to stop at any particular border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azza. And Gianmarco, a final word from you.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, in the European Union, as of day one, we had said the solution to this pandemic must be multilateral. It must be a global solution. And that's why we have also from the beginning rejected any notions of vaccine diplomacy, of giving vaccines away against political favors and all these games which we have seen with some of the other countries. Yes, it is true. Also in the European Union, politicians thought first of serving European citizens. I think that's a very normal reflex, normal reaction. But we have not shut our borders. We have kept exporting vaccines since January and supplying the world. Is it enough? No. We must do much, much more. And this involves, of course, the donations, but much more important actually to go beyond the donations is also to enabling countries to build up manufacturing capacities in Africa, for instance, to prepare also for the next pandemic, and to rally also the world around an international treaty on pandemics, where it is very clear that we must be better prepared as a planet and as humanity for the next pandemic. And I believe that religion and faith groups have a very important role to play in this context.
Great, thank you very much, Gianmarco. We ran a few minutes over, but I think we will all agree that this was time very well spent, extra time very well spent. On behalf of myself, Aaron, and Judd, let me first and foremost thank our panelists for making time to be with us today and for sharing their enormous expertise and experience. And I want to thank all of you who joined us in the audience. This will be archived as a video recording, and those of you registered for the event will all receive a link to it, as well as some additional information that we'll be adding based on the discussion itself and your questions. So finally, let me just thank you all once again for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future at another Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy event hosted by Georgetown University's Berkeley Center. Take care, everyone. Stay healthy, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.